My uncle died and left me a building I didn't know existed. My husband said it was nothing, a clerical error. Then I read the lease. Good day, dear listeners. It's Lena again, and I'm so glad you're here with me today. Before we begin, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and tap the like button. It helps these stories reach the people who need them. And tell me in the comments which city you're listening from. I love seeing just how far these stories travel. We assume the people who love us tell us everything. We assume the documents that shape our lives are the ones we signed ourselves. And we assume that when someone says it's nothing, they have actually looked, that they have read the fine print, opened the envelope, examined the language with their own eyes, and come back with a clear and honest verdict. I carried all three of those assumptions for a long time, pressed flat inside an 18-year marriage where I was the methodical one, the list keeper, the woman with the yellow legal pad on the kitchen counter, and yet there was an entire piece of my financial life sitting in a Shelby County filing. In my maiden name, generating income, quietly waiting for the day I would finally catch up to it. I was not the one who found it. An attorney found it and mailed it to me, 7 weeks after my uncle's funeral, in a manila envelope with a metal clasp. My husband had known it existed for years and said nothing. Have you ever discovered that a silence you lived inside was not neutral? That it was, in fact, a decision someone made on your behalf without your knowledge? That is what I discovered on a Tuesday afternoon in October in the kitchen of the Craftsman House in East Memphis, where I had spent 18 years believing I knew the shape of my own life. What I learned in the weeks that followed is something I did not expect to learn from a legal document. The law is slower than a marriage, but it is also more patient. It does not revise its records because someone decided you did not need to know. It simply waits. The county filing was there in 2001. It was there in 2010. It was there on the morning I finally walked into the Register of Deeds office and held the original in my hands. It was exactly where it had always been. My name had not moved. I am Nadia Okafor. I am 44 years old. I am a licensed property appraiser at a municipal assessment office in Memphis, Tennessee, which means I spend my working days calculating the precise value of things: square footage, condition, age, comparable sales, depreciation schedules, the mathematics of what a property is actually worth versus what its owners believe it to be worth. I am good at this work. I am good at it because I am precise by nature, slow to accept the first number anyone gives me, and trained by 16 years of professional practice to distinguish between what a thing appears to be and what it actually is. That quality served me well in my career. For a specific period of 18 years, I did not always let it serve me at home. I grew up in the South Orange neighborhood of Memphis, the middle child in a family where money was discussed in careful whispers. Not secretive whispers, cautious ones. My father was a man who believed that clarity was a form of respect, and he applied this belief to household accounting with the same quiet discipline he applied to everything else. What we had was known. What we owed was known. What we needed was written down. I absorbed this philosophy before I understood it was a philosophy, the way children absorb most of the things that later turn out to matter. I have been making lists since I was 9 years old, not because I was anxious, not because I didn't trust my memory, but because a list is honest in a way that memory is not. A list tells you exactly what is there and exactly what is missing. It does not soften the gap between the two. It does not revise the numbers to make the picture more comfortable. I kept my first list in a school composition notebook. I kept my second in a spiral pad. By the time I was an adult with a mortgage and a career and a marriage, I had settled on the format that I still use today: a yellow AMPAD legal pad, 50 sheets, blue ruled columns, 1 page per week. What came in, what went out, what was pending, what needed resolution. Every Sunday evening, I would sit at the kitchen counter and update the columns. Dennis called it my accounting habit. He said it the way people describe a partner's quirk, with a small, warm condescension, as though it were a mildly endearing eccentricity rather than the thing that kept our household honest. I never corrected him. The legal pad was not for Dennis. Dennis Okafor was 29 when we married. I was 26. He was a regional sales director for a consumer goods company, a man who moved through rooms with the easy confidence of someone who has never been caught off guard by the information in them. He made decisions quickly. He processed data loudly, or believed he did, which is not always the same thing. He was charming in the way that certain people are charming, not through effort or performance, but through a genuine certainty that his read on any situation was the correct one. This quality was useful in sales. It was, over time, a complicating factor in a marriage with a woman who had been trained since childhood to verify her own numbers. We divided the household the way many couples do when one person is very good at appearing to manage things. He handled what he called the logistics, the mail, the utility accounts, the insurance renewals, the maintenance calls, the scheduling. I handled the work that paid for most of it, and I kept my professional files with the same precision I brought to my assessments. On paper, this was a reasonable division. In practice, it meant that a significant portion of information about our household moved through Dennis before it reached me. I had accepted this as efficiency. I understood it, later as exposure. Our house was a well-kept craftsman in East Memphis, deep front porch, original woodwork. Floors I had refinished myself over a long August weekend when Dennis was at a conference in Dallas. The kitchen caught the morning light in a particular way, low and golden, that made even ordinary mornings feel as though they were made of something worth preserving. On the counter, always, the yellow legal pad. On the refrigerator, Dennis's travel schedule, color-coded by region. Above the window, a small watercolor my aunt had painted of the street in South Orange where I grew up. The kind of painting that is not technically accomplished, but that contains something true about the light at that corner in late afternoon. I loved that kitchen. I still do, though the house belongs to someone else now. My Uncle Calvin was my father's youngest brother. He was quiet in the way that private people are quiet, not withdrawn, not unfriendly, but economical with himself in a way that suggested he understood the value of discretion. He moved between Memphis and Nashville on business that he described as real estate adjacent, and that I never pressed him to specify, partly because he was clearly disinclined to elaborate, and partly because there was always something in his manner that communicated that things were organized, that things were attended to, that he knew exactly where everything was, even when no one else did. He called twice a year, Christmas and my birthday, and the calls had a warmth to them that existed independently of their length. He was not a man who needed to prove affection by taking up time. When I was 22 and graduating from college, he called. The call was similar to the others, warm, brief, not quite revelatory. But he said something I did not register at the time, did not store in any column, did not return to for more than 2 decades. He said he had taken care of something. He said it was something I could depend on, something that would be there when I needed it. I assumed he meant the card with money in it, which arrived the following week. I thanked him for the card when he called next Christmas. He said something like, "That's not what I meant, but Nadia, someday you'll understand." I filed it as a gracious uncle being gracious, and I moved on. He died 11 years ago, in the February of the year his health finally ran out. He had been ill for several years, but had managed it so privately that the family was always slightly surprised by each new stage. Surprised not that he was ill, but that the illness had progressed while he had been maintaining his calendar and his calls and his air of organized self-sufficiency. We attended the service in Nashville. It was a small gathering. Calvin had been careful with his life in ways that extended to his acquaintances. Dennis stayed 2 nights and then drove back to Memphis for a regional meeting that he genuinely could not miss. I stayed 4 days, helped the executor with some practical sorting, drove home on a Sunday evening with that particular hollow feeling that follows a funeral for someone you loved without having known well enough. 7 weeks after the funeral, a manila envelope arrived. The specific kind, manila with a metal clasp, the kind that was standard correspondence equipment from a certain generation of legal offices, and that has never quite been replaced, because nothing else closes the same way or carries the same institutional weight. The return address was a probate attorney in Memphis, Ray Hutchins, attorney at law, estate and property. I put it on the kitchen counter beside the legal pad. Dennis was home that evening. He sorted through the day's mail at the kitchen table, which I registered as slightly unusual because Dennis always sorted mail standing at the entry table, a quick standing pass, never sitting. And when he reached the manila envelope, he looked at the return address, set it in the pile, and said, without looking up, "Just sign whatever it is and send it back." I almost did. I want to be honest about this, because I think it is the most important detail in the story, more important than the dollar figures, more important than the lease itself. The habit of deference is not a character flaw. It is a pattern that builds over years, quietly, assembled from 1,000 small moments of accepting someone else's assessment in place of your own. He sorted, I appraised. He summarized, I accepted the summary. For 18 years that it operated as a functional division of the household's information, on that evening, the division almost swallowed $2 million. I did not sign. I set the envelope down and went to work. I came home the next evening, and the house was quiet. Dennis was in Nashville for an overnight meeting, and the envelope was still on the counter, the metal clasp reflecting the kitchen light. I took it to the table, unclasped it, and pulled out 3 items. But first, let me tell you about 2 things I had noticed in the weeks after Calvin's funeral. Because they matter. And because they are the kinds of things that a property appraiser notices, which is to say the kinds of things that most people would not notice or would notice and decide were nothing. The first was the mail. For as long as I could remember, Dennis sorted the mail standing at the entry table, a standing pass, a quick division, 45 seconds from door to counter. It was so consistent that I had stopped registering it as a behavior and simply registered it as how the mail worked. After Calvin's death, Dennis began sitting at the kitchen table to sort the mail. Not always, not dramatically, but often enough that I noticed the change and registered it without naming it. He was sitting for the mail now. Something about sitting for the mail in the kitchen when standing at the entry had been the habit for 18 years, suggested that he was reading more carefully than usual. I filed that observation in the part of my mind where I keep unverified data. The second was Pauline, Dennis's mother, 71 years old, retired, a woman who had spent her adult life in the comfortable conviction that she was the competent center of every room she entered. Pauline called our house twice in the week after Calvin's funeral to ask about what she called that uncle situation. Pauline had never met Calvin. She had attended our wedding. Calvin had been invited and had sent a gift and a note explaining that he could not travel, but she had no relationship to my family, no connection to the Memphis probate, no conceivable reason to be tracking my uncle's estate. When I mentioned it to Dennis, he said she was just being supportive. He said this looking slightly to the left of my face. I did not pursue it. I picked up the legal pad and wrote a line and put a question mark beside it, and I left the question mark there for 3 more weeks before I understood what the answer was. On the Tuesday in October when everything changed, Dennis was in Nashville. The October light in that kitchen was the specific kind that comes in lower than summer and makes the woodwork look amber and makes the whole room feel like it is existing at a slight remove from the rest of the day. I took the manila envelope to the table. I unclasped it. I pulled out 3 items, a probate asset schedule with a cover letter attached, and a photocopy of a commercial lease assignment document. I read the cover letter first. It was from Ray Hutchins, estate attorney, the attorney of record for Calvin's probate. He wrote that he was contacting me to confirm the transfer of a lease assignment asset to the named beneficiary, that he had assumed I had been notified through the family, and that he looked forward to hearing from me at my earliest convenience. He had been making this assumption for 7 weeks. Then I read the lease assignment. It was a commercial lease on a 3,400 square foot storefront in Memphis, a regional pharmacy chain, a long-term tenant with an operating history at that location going back 20 years. The original lease had been executed 3 decades ago, 22 years before that Tuesday morning, in the year of my college graduation. My uncle Calvin had formally assigned that lease, transferred the legal right to receive all rent payments under it for the remaining term of the lease and any renewals to a named assignee. The named assignee was Nadia Eunice Calvin, my maiden name. I sat very still. I read it again. Nadia Eunice Calvin, the name I was given at birth, the name I carried through school and through South Orange and through college, the name I had replaced with Okafor 18 years ago so automatically that I rarely thought about the other one anymore. Calvin had not replaced it. Calvin had written it into a legally recorded commercial document 22 years ago in the year I graduated, and he had not told me. And the assignment had been sitting in the Shelby County Register of Deeds ever since, in my name, before Dennis and I had ever said a word to each other. Current monthly rent, $8,400. Lease term remaining, 7 years. Estimated asset value, per the appraiser's note attached, $1.97 million. Do you know that specific stillness that comes when your mind has understood something but your body is still catching up to it? That was the moment at the kitchen table. The light through the windows, the legal pad open beside me with the previous week's columns, the lease assignment in my hands with my maiden name in black type at the top of the beneficiary line. I read the documents 3 more times. Then I called Ray Hutchins, and his assistant put me through immediately. He had, it turned out, been waiting for my call for 7 weeks, and he said, carefully and warmly, that he had assumed I knew. He said Calvin had spoken of me often over the years. He said Calvin had wanted me to have something that was entirely and only mine, something with my real name on it, something that had been arranged well before the rest of my adult life had taken shape. He said Calvin had been very deliberate about the timing of the assignment and about the name he used when he executed it. I thanked him. I set down the phone. I sat at the kitchen table in the October light for another full minute. Then I picked up the legal pad, turned to a fresh page, and wrote Dennis's name at the top of a new column. I underlined it once. Dennis came home the following evening. I had cooked dinner, the kind of meal that keeps your hands occupied and your face neutral. We sat at the table, and the food was what it was, and when the plates were cleared, I put the probate letter and the lease assignment on the table between us and asked whether he recognized what he was looking at. He looked at the documents for a moment. He looked at the table. He set down his water glass. And then, with the specific exhale of a man who has been managing a secret long enough that the management has become more exhausting than the secret, he told me the truth. Calvin had called him, he said, not once, not recently, but years ago, during the early years of our marriage, when Calvin had still been healthy and managing his affairs with his usual quiet attention. Calvin had described the lease assignment, had said he wanted to make sure Nadia knew it was there, had asked Dennis to pass the information along. Dennis had told Calvin that Nadia didn't need the complication. He said she was building her career. They had enough going on. The property would only create confusion and administrative burden, and it would be simpler to let the assignment remain in the estate and allow it to resolve quietly at the appropriate time. He framed all of this as protection. He described it as a careful decision made on my behalf, for my benefit, by someone who understood the demands of my life and had concluded, without asking me, that I would prefer not to know. He said Calvin had seemed uncertain, but had deferred to Dennis's judgment. He said Dennis had told the executor the same thing, that Nadia was not interested in managing additional assets at this time. He said he had been acting in my best interest. I asked if he had any legal authority to speak on my behalf to Calvin's estate executor. He said, "I was your husband." I left the kitchen. I went out through the back door and sat in the car in the driveway in the dark. The engine was off. The neighborhood was quiet in that way that East Memphis neighborhoods get quiet in October. The leaves turning, the porch lights on, the occasional car. I sat there for 22 minutes, which I know because I watched the dashboard clock the way I watch anything that might later need to be measured. I thought about the 22 years since Calvin had walked into a county clerk's office and recorded a document in my maiden name. I thought about the 7 years since his death, during which an escrow account had been accumulating monthly rent payments in my name because the named beneficiary had never come forward. I thought about my husband, in the kitchen, with the legal pad still open on the counter. I thought about the column I had started with his name at the top. Then I went inside and called Ray Hutchins's after-hours line. What Dennis had done was not protection. I understand that some people will want to give him the benefit of a complicated doubt, and I understand why. It is easier to believe that the people we choose decided to omit things from kindness rather than from control. I spent some time believing that myself. But here is what is true. He had intercepted a communication between my uncle and me. He had redirected a legal process to which he was not a party. He had spoken to an estate executor on my behalf without any authority to do so. And he had made a choice about my financial life that was not his to make. He had done this specifically and demonstrably with an asset worth nearly $2 million. That is not protection. That is management. And the distinction matters enormously. Ray Hutchins confirmed, the following morning, exactly what I had started to understand from the documents alone. He pulled the original lease assignment filing from the Shelby County property records and walked me through it in his office, a quiet room in East Memphis with files arranged by date and matter number, and nothing out of place. He was methodical and respectful and did not explain things I had not asked him to explain, which I appreciated. The assignment was executed in my maiden name, Nadia Eunice Calvin. It was recorded before my marriage. Under Tennessee Code 364121, property received by gift, bequest, or direct assignment to a named individual prior to marriage is separate property. It belongs to that individual alone, regardless of what happens in the marriage thereafter. The income produced by a separate property asset during a marriage is income from that asset, but it does not transform the asset itself into marital property. The lease, the storefront, and all the rights that went with them were mine. They had been mine for 22 years. Dennis had no legal standing to redirect that assignment, and Calvin's executor had had no obligation to honor a verbal instruction from a non-party to the estate. Then, Ray told me what I had not yet calculated. The pharmacy chain, following standard probate protocol when a named beneficiary fails to come forward to claim an asset, had been depositing the monthly rent of $8,400 into a dormant escrow account in my maiden name since the month of Calvin's death. 7 years, 84 monthly payments, $705,600. I did the arithmetic while Ray watched me with the quiet patience of a man who has given people large numbers before and understands that they need a moment to become real. The arithmetic was correct. $705,600 was sitting in a dormant escrow account in the name Nadia Eunice Calvin at a regional bank waiting for the named beneficiary to appear and collect what was hers. It had been waiting for 7 years, and it had not lost patience. I looked at Ray. He said, "The estate has been patient." I said, "So has the law." Dennis retained a real estate attorney within 5 days of our conversation in the kitchen. His argument was that the lease proceeds constituted marital income, that $8,400 per month, generated every month for the 7 years of Calvin's probate, had been produced during our marriage and therefore qualified for equitable division under Tennessee law. From a distance, as an argument, it had a logic to it. From inside the law, it was less durable than Dennis expected. Ray's counter was clear and grounded in statute. Tennessee 364121 draws the line at the asset itself, not the income it produces. The underlying asset, the commercial lease, the assignment, the right to receive rent, predated the marriage by 22 years. That asset was separate property. Income generated by a separate asset during a marriage does not convert the asset into marital property. The storefront remained separate. The lease remained separate. The escrow, which was the accumulated income of a separate asset, followed the asset. The pharmacy chain's corporate counsel confirmed all of this in writing. When Ray contacted them, the lease was valid. Nadia Eunice Calvin was the recorded assignee. The escrow had been maintained in her name, and the balance was available for distribution upon beneficiary confirmation. When Dennis's attorney received the full statutory analysis and the escrow balance documentation, there was 4 days of quiet in the correspondence. I recognized that quiet. It is the sound of a number being recalculated because the initial figure did not hold. I used those 4 days deliberately. I went to the Shelby County Register of Deeds office myself. I wanted to hold the original recording in my hands, not a photocopy, not a scan, but the actual stamped document, the way it had been filed the year I graduated from college. The clerk at the counter retrieved it without ceremony and handed it across to me, and I took it to a table by the window and read it twice, slowly, the way you read something that has been true for a long time without your knowing it. The assignment was clean and unambiguous. Calvin had executed it correctly, recorded it at the right office, and structured it in a way that required no further action from me to remain valid. He had written my maiden name into the beneficiary line in a way that identified me specifically, not as a member of the family, not as a future wife, not as someone whose circumstances might change, but as Nadia Eunice Calvin, the specific person she was at the moment of the graduation he was celebrating. The document had been sitting in the county records for 22 years, waiting for the moment it was needed. I thought about Calvin at that table by the window. I thought about his twice-yearly calls, his brief warm words, his air of organized self-sufficiency. I thought about what he had said when I graduated, that he had taken care of something, that it was something I could depend on, and I understood now that he had not been speaking abstractly. He had been describing a document he had just filed at the county courthouse. He had not told me what it was, because he had wanted it to be beyond the reach of any conversation, any negotiation, any husband who might decide on my behalf that I did not need to know. He had been thinking about this for a long time. The mediation was scheduled for a Thursday in January. The conference room was downtown, clean, neutral, fluorescently lit in the specific way of rooms that exist only to reach resolutions. Dennis arrived with his attorney and a prepared argument. I arrived with Ray and the legal pad. The pharmacy chain's corporate counsel had submitted written confirmation in advance. The escrow documents were in evidence. Everything was where it needed to be. Dennis's attorney advanced their position with professionalism. The accrued escrow, $705,600, was income generated during the marriage and qualified for equitable consideration as a marital asset under Tennessee equitable distribution principles. It was the strongest version of Dennis's argument, and they made it well. Ray produced the handwritten letter. It was from Calvin's probate file, a letter Calvin had written to his executor at the time the probate was opened, before his death, leaving instructions. Calvin had wanted to be sure that the instructions were unambiguous. The letter was short. He wrote that the lease assignment was for Nadia alone. He wrote that he had always wanted her to have something that no one could redirect. Something with her own name on it, something arranged before the world had a chance to reorganize it on someone else's terms. He wrote it in plain, even paced language, the language of a man who understood that the sentence might one day need to stand in a room without him to explain it. The mediator read the letter. She read the statute. She noted that the escrow account had been held in the name Nadia Eunice Calvin throughout the 7 years since Calvin's death. She noted that the escrow had never been jointly held, never been titled to the marriage, never been treated as a shared account by any party to the probate. Dennis's attorney reviewed the documents in silence. Then, Dennis looked at me. I was writing in the legal pad. I did not look up. I was starting a new list, not about the settlement, not about the property, but about the weeks ahead. Practical things. Steps in an order. The kind of list that signals that the problem has been resolved and what remains is the work. The mediation settled in a single afternoon. The lease assignment, the Memphis storefront, and the full escrow balance of $705. $600 were confirmed as my separate property under Tennessee Code 364121. Dennis received the equitable division of the marital assets, the house, the joint investment accounts, the accumulated ordinary property of 18 shared years. The Memphis property was not among them. It had never been among them. The law had understood this for 22 years, even when the people inside the marriage had not. 3 weeks later, the pharmacy chain mailed the first post-probate rent check directly to Nadia Eunice Calvin. I opened it on a Saturday morning in my new apartment, a second-floor unit in Midtown with large windows and afternoon light, and a kitchen counter where the yellow legal pad sits in exactly the same spot it always has. I read the name on the check. I did not correct it. I set it on the counter and stood there for a moment, looking at my maiden name on an official document from a regional pharmacy company. And I thought, he knew this name. He kept it. He put it on a legal document and made sure it would still be there when it was needed. 6 months after the mediation closed, I had lunch with Ray Hutchins and my sister Teresa at a restaurant on Poplar Avenue, where the light through the tall windows is generous and slow. Teresa cried at the table. She had been holding something for months. Guilt about the years she hadn't asked more questions. Relief that the document had held. Something else that was harder to name. I did not cry. I ordered the same thing I always order when I am at that restaurant. I brought the legal pad. At the top of a fresh page I wrote, "New column." I have not decided what to put under it yet. There are several possibilities. I am still thinking. There is a particular kind of love that announces itself in paperwork rather than in words. It does not explain its reasoning. It does not require acknowledgement. It simply executes the necessary steps, files the appropriate documents, writes the name that belongs to the person it loves, and trusts that the record will be there when it matters. Calvin did not leave me a building. He did not leave me an explanation. He left me proof, clear, recorded, county-stamped proof, that someone had seen me. Not as Dennis's wife, not as the quiet middle child, not as the woman who kept the columns but was still manageable. As Nadia Eunice Calvin, the specific person she had always been, in the name that had existed before any of the rest of it, in a document that required no one else's permission to be true. That is a particular kind of permanence. It is the permanence of a county record in a filing system that does not care about relationships or convenience or a husband's assessment of what his wife needs to know. It simply holds the name. It simply holds the date. It waits. Let me tell you more about the morning I first walked into Ray Hutchins's office, because the specifics matter in a way that the general shape of a story cannot capture. It was a Wednesday, late October, 10 days after I had opened the envelope. The trees along Union Avenue were already turning, that particular Memphis October where the color arrives before the cold, where you can still have the windows cracked in the morning and watch the leaves shift from green to amber in what feels like a single afternoon. I drove to Ray's office alone. I had not told Dennis I was going. Ray's office was on the second floor of a brick building near Overton Square, the kind of building that has housed attorneys and accountants and insurance agents for 50 years, and has the specific smell of old carpet and climate control and good intentions. His assistant showed me to a conference room with a round table and 4 chairs and a window that looked out onto the parking lot, and, beyond it, a strip of sky between 2 older buildings. Ray came in carrying a folder and a legal pad of his own, yellow, which I noticed and appreciated, and sat down across from me without preamble. He asked me to tell him what I understood about the assignment. I told him everything I had read in the envelope in the order I had read it. He listened without interrupting, which is a quality I respect in an attorney and encounter less often than I should. When I finished, he opened his folder and placed the Shelby County recording on the table between us. The recording was 7 pages. The assignment document itself was 2 pages, and the remaining 5 were the exhibits. The original lease, the amendment, the legal description of the property, the notarized signatures. Ray walked me through each page. He explained the structure of a commercial lease assignment in language that was precise without being condescending. He was used to clients who knew their own professional territory, and he adjusted accordingly. When he reached the page with my maiden name in the beneficiary line, he paused and said, "That is your name as it appears in the Shelby County records. It has been there since 2001. No one has filed anything to alter it." I read the line again. Nadia Eunice Calvin. The county stamp beside it was faded with age. The ink pressed into the paper in the way that ink presses into paper after 20 years, slightly absorbed, slightly softened, but entirely legible, entirely mine. Ray then explained the statutory framework. Tennessee Code 36-4-121, he said, is clear on separate property. What you receive before the marriage is yours. What you inherit during the marriage is yours. What a family member assigns directly to you, in your name, using your premarital identity, before you have married anyone. That is separate property in the most unambiguous sense the statute provides. He said Dennis's attorney would argue that the income generated during the marriage was marital, and he said he was already prepared to address that argument, and he said I should understand that the income question and the asset question were distinct, and that the law treated them accordingly. I asked him how strong the position was. He looked at me the way attorneys look at clients when the answer is good, but they don't want to invite overconfidence. He said, "The assignment is clean. The recording is clean. The statute is clear. What your uncle did was thorough." I thought about Calvin in that moment. Calvin in some attorney's office in 2001, signing his name to a document that would sit in a county filing for 2 decades until it was needed. I thought about how deliberate that act must have been. You do not assign a commercial lease to a specific individual in a specific maiden name without understanding precisely what you are doing. He was not being sentimental. He was being exact. He was a quiet man who arranged things with precision, and who had arranged this one with a particular care that I was only now beginning to understand. The pharmacy location itself was on a commercial block in East Memphis, not far from the neighborhood where I grew up, actually, which I found meaningful in a way I could not entirely articulate. A regional pharmacy chain, family-owned originally and then acquired by a larger operator, had been at that address for 30 years. The storefront was 3,400 square feet of well-maintained retail space with a parking lot and good foot traffic, and a lease that was, by any professional measure, a good lease. I know what a good commercial lease looks like. I have appraised enough properties to recognize one. This was a lease with a creditworthy tenant, a long-term, a reasonable escalation clause, and a history of on-time payments. It was, in other words, exactly the kind of asset that a careful man would choose for a gift intended to last. $8,400 per month. I walked the block where the pharmacy stood on a Saturday afternoon. After my meeting with Ray and before the mediation had been scheduled, I parked my car on the side street and walked past the front of the building, the pharmacy sign, the plate glass windows, the parking lot with its painted lines, and the kind of steady, ordinary commercial activity that happens at a pharmacy on a Saturday. The building was well kept. The signage was current. People were going in and out. I stood on the sidewalk for a few minutes, watching the ordinary commerce of a storefront that had been generating income in my name for 7 years without my knowledge, and I thought about what it means to have something in the world that is yours without your knowing it. The building did not know my name. It was simply doing what it had always done. I was the variable that had been missing from the equation. The utility work in the procedural stage was exhausting in the specific way that legal work is exhausting, not physically, but with the cumulative weight of precision. Ray and I met 4 more times before the mediation. Each meeting produced something, a new document from the pharmacy chain's counsel, a statutory cite that addressed a specific counterargument Dennis's attorney was advancing, a timeline I assembled of the correspondence between Dennis and Calvin's executor that Ray had subpoenaed through the probate file. That correspondence was illuminating. There were 3 communications, not one, 3 separate contacts between Dennis and Calvin's executor over the course of a year, each of which Dennis had conducted without telling me, and each of which had been aimed at redirecting or delaying the beneficiary confirmation process. I read those communications at Ray's conference room table and sat with what they told me. 3 deliberate contacts over 12 months. He had not forgotten. He had not misjudged. He had made a sustained, repeated decision. I did not tell Teresa about the communications until after the mediation. She would have been angry in a way that would have required managing, and I had no capacity for managing anyone else's anger during that period. I had my own responses to contain. I was not angry. Exactly, that is not quite the right word for what I felt. What I felt was a specific, cold clarity, the clarity of a person who has been carrying a weight without knowing it and has now had it itemized and explained and set on a scale so she can see exactly what it weighed. That is different from anger. Anger is reactive. What I felt was informational. Pauline called me twice during the procedural period. I did not answer. The first call came when I was in Ray's office. The second came on a Sunday evening when I was updating the legal pad. I let both calls go to voicemail. Pauline's messages were the kind of messages that are meant to sound concerned while communicating pressure. How are you doing? Are you sure this is the path you want? Dennis is very worried. This could be resolved simply if you were just willing to talk. I transcribed both messages onto the legal pad, word for word, and added them to Dennis's column. Then I put the legal pad face down and went back to the documents. The escrow account details, when the pharmacy chain's corporate counsel finally provided them in full, were more organized than I had expected. The account had been maintained at a regional bank under the title Nadia Eunice Calvin Beneficiary, Hutchins Estate Probate, with monthly deposits made on the 15th of each month for 84 consecutive months. The account had earned interest at a standard savings rate. The total including interest was slightly above the principal, $712,840. Ray noted this in his letter to Dennis's attorney without comment. The number spoke for itself. Dennis's attorney argued in their final pre-mediation submission that the accrued balance represented marital income because the rent had been generated during the marriage, and because Nadia had, through her failure to come forward and claim the asset. implicitly treated the income as deferred and therefore subject to marital treatment at the time of dissolution. It was a creative argument. Ray called it creative. He did not call it persuasive. He submitted the statutory authority. Income from separate property is the fruit of the tree, not the tree, and the letter Calvin had written to his executor, and 3 pages of case law from Tennessee appellate courts that had addressed similar questions over the preceding decade. The mediation room was as I have described it: downtown, fluorescent, neutral. I arrived before Dennis and his attorney. I sat on the window side of the table, the side that faced the building across the street. I opened the legal pad. I did not write anything yet. I simply had it there, open, because the legal pad being open on the table is a signal, to myself, primarily, that I am in the working posture, the recording posture, the posture of a person who is gathering data and not performing distress. Dennis came in 5 minutes after I arrived. He did not meet my eyes directly. He sat down across from me. His attorney, a sharp-looking man in his 50s, whose name I will not record here, arranged his own files with the practiced efficiency of someone who has been in many mediations and knows the rhythms. The mediator, a woman in her 60s, a retired family court judge, unhurried and precise, arrived last and set down her folder and looked at everyone at the table with the specific look of someone who has seen this situation before and will see it again and intends to get through it methodically. Dennis's attorney made his argument. He was good at it. He structured it clearly, acknowledged the statutory framework, and advanced the marital income position with specificity. He cited the 84 months, the dollar amounts, the regularity of the deposits. He argued equitable principles in addition to statutory ones. He had done his work. Ray produced the letter. He placed it in the center of the table. A photocopy. The original having been sealed back into the probate file by the clerk's office, and he said, simply, "This is a letter from Calvin, written to his executor before his death, concerning the assignment." The mediator picked it up. She read it without expression. She set it down. Then Ray produced the Shelby County recording, then the statutory authority, then the account statement from the bank showing 84 deposits in the name Nadia Eunice Calvin with no joint account holder at any point in the account's history. Dennis looked at the lease assignment for a long time. The photocopy of the document, the one that had arrived in the manila envelope, was in the evidence binder. He had seen it before, in other filings and other correspondence. But he looked at it now the way you look at a thing when the context around it has changed completely, when you understand, finally, what it meant all along. Then he looked at me. I was writing in the legal pad. I had, at some point while Ray was presenting, picked up the pen and begun a new list. I was not looking at Dennis. I was writing the names and contact information of 3 things I needed to do in the following week. The Midtown apartment I had already toured, the utilities I needed to put in my own name, the bank where I intended to open the account into which the pharmacy rent would be deposited. I was writing these things in small, neat columns while my attorney was dismantling my husband's final legal position across the table. I did not look up. The settlement was reached before 4 o'clock. One single afternoon, as Ray had predicted, he had told me, the week before, that cases with this clarity of statutory authority tend to resolve quickly once the other side has received the full documentary picture. The resolution confirmed the lease assignment, the storefront, and the full escrow balance as separate property. Dennis received the equitable portion of the joint assets. The Craftsman house would be sold and the proceeds divided. The joint investment accounts were divided per the disclosure schedules. The cars, the furniture, the 18 years of accumulated ordinary property divided. Recorded, finalized, the Memphis property was not in any of those columns. It was in mine. It had always been in mine. The first check arrived on a Tuesday, 6 weeks after the settlement. A Tuesday in March, gray and cold. The kind of Memphis March that cannot decide whether it is still winter. I was at the kitchen counter in the Midtown apartment. The yellow legal pad opened beside the coffee maker when the mail arrived through the slot in the door. The pharmacy chain's envelope was standard business correspondence. White, windowed, with the company logo in the upper left corner. I took it to the counter. I opened it. The check was made out to Nadia Eunice Calvin for $8,400. I set it on the counter and stood there for a long moment, looking at my name. Not Okafor, not the married name that 18 years had made automatic, the name I was born with, the name my uncle had written into a county document the year I graduated, the name the pharmacy company had been writing on a check every month for 7 years without anyone collecting it. It was just a check. It was also something else, something I did not try to name. I set it aside to deposit that afternoon and updated the legal pad with the new column heading, Rent. First entry, $8,400. The column was just starting. Dear listeners, if there is an envelope sitting somewhere with your real name on it, the name that was yours before anyone else got involved in defining you, it is worth opening, even if someone has already told you it's nothing. Especially then, read everything. Know your own name on your own documents. And if this story reached someone you know, someone in a situation where a silence has gone on too long, please share it with them. They may need to hear that the record is still there, even if no one told them. I'm grateful you were here today. Leave me your city in the comments, and I'll see you next time.